Hello, in this video I want to go over your direct copy. But before we talk a little bit about our homework, I wanted to take a moment to speak a little bit more about my work personally and my relationship with master copies. Almost ever since the earliest moments in which I made work, I've had a fascination with using other artists' work as the basis of my work. This is a relatively recent piece, and although it may not appear at first, I'm pulling its composition from Bruegel's The Blind Leading the Blind. I use master copies as both a starting point and as a way to kind of ground me in my subject matter. In this copy of this painting came from a very quick and small sketch of Mark Tobey. And this figurative piece by Mark Tobey really kind of captured all the emotion that I wanted in my larger piece. And I used, and I typically use figurative work that is imbued with narrative, um, that uses a lot of kind of mark making to capture form, like this Kathy Kolovitz. And I build my abstract paintings, my abstract drawings, my abstract prints using the compositional structure, borrowing that compositional structure from master copies. In this print right here, you can see I'm pulling from Tatlin's Tower. And by pulling his form, I am imbuing my work with his content. Now, sometimes the master copy or the reference is not very obvious. This series of works is based off of the palettes of Edward Voulard, and his work is very figurative, and I don't anticipate anybody looking at this grid of paintings and thinking, oh, Edward Voulard. But his work acted as a starting point for me. And I marry both his use of color and his content. He has these figures who are kind of blended into their background. They become part of their background, where the female figures are kind of lost in their interiors and they're just kind of becoming the patterns of the wallpaper. And so I'm pulling both from the palette and the pattern. And by working from master copies, I not only get to kind of study and examine what it is I love about these pieces of work and how they move me, and my work kind of responds to my love of these pieces, but it also kind of keeps me focused on the content within my own work. So by returning again and again to this, in some cases, one image, it kind of grounds me in my content. So for my direct copy, I am going to do a demo in which I pull directly from the work of Carrie James Marshall. It feels really appropriate to use Carrie James Marshall this way. I think of Marshall as an artist who really draws on the history of figurative painting and makes a lot of references to specifically European figurative painting. And he is somebody who both questions it and honors it. And I love that art can do both, that you can pull from a master copy and both honor what you love in that work, but also question its intent. Carrie James Marshall is somebody who talks really openly about loving museums and being part of museums and loving looking at work, but also questions the kind of hierarchy that's set up in museums where Western European white figurative artists are given kind of are considered more serious, and everybody else in the world is kind of given second tier. And so he both pulls from that work, but also actively discusses wanting to put Black bodies in museums. And so if you've ever heard a lecture by him or read an interview by him, he talks really beautifully about the dichotomy of loving museums and questioning the way they curate and define culture. So it just feels to me, as somebody who knows that he loves painting, it feels really like, and does a lot of direct copies and pulls from compositions, it feels like honoring him by doing a copy and really diving in feels really appropriate. So I've kind of begun already, just a few basic colors. I've got piles of colors that I've pulled that I think are going to work well for key moments. And I have his image on my computer screen right in front of me. So I'm going to be directly looking at it and pulling from it. And when you do your direct copy, it makes sense to choose a design or an image that is already 2D versus picking kind of a sculptural work to do this part of. Because when you're looking at a sculpture, you're really looking at the photographer's interpretation of that sculpture. So that's just my recommendation. You can, by all means, choose to do a direct copy of a sculpture. It would just be kind of a different thing. So I've started to pull some colors, and as I pull them, they're of course going to read slightly different in the screen. And as you start to pull your colors, you want to, when I do my copy, I'm not going to try to get every single color in that he has, but kind of these big basic shapes. And the key is to get them kind of in the same relationship. So the copy should try to be proportionally and faithful to the original. But as you see, I'm going to be doing lots of editing and simplifying. So I'm in no means going to have every single color that he has in it. I'm really going to be kind of paring down his image. But the colors that I do, that I am going to use, I'm going to try to keep them roughly like a simplified version of that same shape. Okay. So I like to collage on top of Japanese style mulberry paper. So this is Okawara. And it's got some kind of paint on it already, just as you can see is kind of similar to the palette I've already chosen. So I have some kind of scraps of it. And I like collaging on this material because it's really super thin, but very, very strong. And I just find it is a really beautiful paper. And for how thin it is, it's very strong. So I like my works on paper to be sometimes a little bit more delicate. So I'm going to be using our thicker, I am going to be using our thick color aid, but I'm also going to be mounting on kind of a thinner paper. When I get to the stage of gluing, I'm going to be using Yes Paste. I like Yes Paste because it's essentially what is in a glue stick, but it's a little bit cheaper. It's very similar to Nori paste, which I also absolutely love. It's just easy to buy Yes Paste in huge containers and tends to be a little cheaper. And so I just happen to have a ton of it, and also use Nori. It is a little thicker and it's really great for very thin papers. It's a wheat-based dexatrin. It's not as smooth as Nori. I think Nori is a little bit smoother, but Nori is also a little bit wetter. So there's that. I will card it on. So I have, some credit cards and bank cards and insurance cards for carding it on. I also have a piece of plexi, and sometimes I use kind of like a really fancy piece of glass for this. If I'm doing a lot of kind of arranging collages, and this works really well with glass, kind of a non-glare glass because it has less static. But if I'm kind of doing a bunch of pieces and they're all kind of laid on top of each other, and I want to kind of just see what they look like, I sometimes like to put a piece of plexi down on them. And from my point of view, there's no glare. So you can kind of see it just flattens everything. And from my point of view, it just kind of acts as if the whole thing has kind of quickly fixes it. And as long as it's not super staticky, you can then kind of pull it off. So a non-glare, static-free glass works really well, and then just kind of tape the edges so that you don't get hurt. But my plexi is a good fix for now. All right, let's begin. So I feel pretty good about this base color. It looks a little purpler.
in the image, in my photo, and I just want to start to kind of build out this window frame. And one of the first things I want to kind of note, yes, there are some slight um, um, things that are slightly off. It's not a perfect, an absolute perfect copy. This image is a little bit narrower. I'm going to kind of trim it down just a little bit so that's a little bit more um, to scale. You can kind of hand do this like I'm doing, or you can, print off your master copy and do a direct cut through. I am choosing to kind of do this a little bit more intuitively, mostly so that I can, for me, focus on the color rather than the drawing of it, because I tend to be somebody who gets really carried away with the drawing, and I really just want to focus on how the colors work together. So the first thing I started doing as I was playing with it was I'm really interested in how you have this kind of purple framework around this piece that then kind of frames all these beautiful neutrals. And to me, frames all these beautiful kind of warm yellowy neutrals that then have all these crazy bright kind of colors on top of them. And I love the kind of colors that happen around the window frame. So this kind of bright yellow around, and then kind of the almost orange-like frame in here. So there's lots of these like kind of delicate grids upon grids that I think are really beautiful. And as I was doing that, I kind of thought that was going to be my focus. But the more I kind of played with it, the more I realized that this outside border of kind of cool gray blues really set this off and made it feel warm. So I've kind of come back and forth over whether or not I need to have this like this blue in it, and it's a lot more neutral than it looks on your screen. So it's a pretty neutral blue. Much more like it is in the image. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that I do need to have this blue. So I'm going to start working on that, kind of adding all this frame, adding a little bit of framework around it. And I love how there's a moment where you're seeing the side of the building and there's this kind of color comes through and just makes a tiny little sliver. Now, that probably seems like a really insignificant little detail, especially since once it comes to this window, I'm going to dramatically simplify it and probably just pick one or two colors out of this whole area that I'm pulling. But I find that this color here works really nicely because it's the echo for the next kind of color that comes in. So it's that here it is right here. It's that the towel in her hair also is kind of picked up and echoed throughout the image. And so it's both kind of the color kind of in the shoes and in this just the slight sliver. And so there are these multiple colors that kind of navigate through. So as you are looking at your piece, it's really easy to get kind of lost in every single little color change. Try not to, try to decide that you're kind of telling a color story, and it might be a small color like this, but that might be important versus like the red that's in, I might tell this blue color story about that blue kind of navigating through rather than the red navigating through, which is also in her shoes, in the flowers, in the voyeur's room, in the bag that's on the shelf. So there is a red story that's kind of moving through, and there is this blue story that's moving through. And I am going to pick up on this blue story that's moving through. So I'm going to incorporate this, even though it's kind of can almost feel superficial. I really want to be able to just kind of stick stuff inside there. So I'm going to experiment with what would happen if I um, only glue down section of it. I don't know how well this is going to work. It might kind of come back and bite me, but I'm not also super worried about just trying. Now, if you're wondering why it is I'm building this in this kind of way where I'm starting in some places, and obviously I haven't made this the right dimensions, and I'm planning on kind of cropping it, um, part of the way I like to work is by allowing myself to be very open. Um, I find that I personally do my best work when I am working a little bit, when I'm problem solving and working a little bit more intuitively. And that if I don't just start and jump um, in the end, I'll actually find it harder to make any decisions. Um, and so for me, it's better to just kind of dive in, start cutting, start gluing, even if I get myself into a situation where I have to kind of pull something apart and restart an area. Um, that is actually fine for me. Um, I like to problem solve. You might be somebody who needs to kind of cut all of your pieces out and lay them out and really have a plan, and get really stressed out if you don't know what you're doing with all your pieces. So um, I don't want this to as much be a demo about how to make this piece, but but how this piece should kind of what this piece should consider. So what do I mean when I mean a direct copy? How direct? And you can see I'm going through and I'm being pretty faithful, even if some of my dimensions, I'm going to crop this image here and probably crop it here and going to add a little bit more information here. Even if not everything is perfect, I am going through and trying to study each color and figure out what each of these colors roles in my larger image is. And so I'm giving myself time to kind of discover that.
Given the image I was working with, it seemed that it was going to be very important to experiment with how I layered my papers. So much of what I played around with by working intuitively was what was going to go on top of what. So here you can see I'm cutting out a background piece and strategically leaving a little bit of the paper coming through so that it could act as the kind of light catching the edge of the windowsill. So my under paper is coming through. I didn't work with a template, and so I took a moment since this area got a little intense to sketch out on a piece of newspaper or newsprint the basic proportions, um, and kind of created what acted as a storyboard um, for my collage pieces. This way of working worked for me because it caused me to focus on the color and the shapes rather than trying to capture every little nuance that was happening within the larger painting. And so while I did kind of capture a lot of tiny little movements, um, by not directly uh, doing a cut through or a transfer method, um, kind of left me making the decisions of what to keep and what to edit.
Hello. I have been working on this collage for about 3 hours. Now, it might seem like that is a lot of time to invest in such a small collage, but it has been time spent examining and studying and getting to know a painting that I love. Um, so I feel like it's been well spent. Um, as you look at my image and the Carrie James Marshall that I'm copying, you can see that I've simplified lots of elements from it. I have kind of cut out all of the leaves. There's some kind of moments like the ledge that are missing. I've kind of distilled it into the kind of three colors or hue families that I wanted to focus on. And that's the purples, these kind of neutral purples that are kind of defining, that kind of drew me to this image in the first place, juxtaposed against these warm, ochre yellows, so a complementary set. And I chose to focus on a kind of teal blues that are running through this composition. Now, the image that I'm copying has lots of different hues and colors in it. And Marshall is kind of juggling a couple different kind of color movements as he goes. I chose to focus on picking up this moment of teal and how it kind of echoes through the image. I didn't pick up how it echoes in the shoe, but you can kind of see how the highest chroma moment is probably the towel. And then there's these shoes, and then there's these like little moments right in here where it catches the edge of the windowsill. It's also kind of existing in the outer frame, these kind of echoes of blue. And because I decided to kind of focus on these blues, I chose to make this back negative space a very dark teal. Now, as you look at this backspace in the original, you can see it's made up of lots of different colors. It definitely has a lot of these dark teals in it, but it also has yellows and pinks and even some kind of purpley hues as well. So, this coat area in the background is kind of capturing or kind of absorbing or kind of including all the different kind of colors that are happening throughout that composition. And it's the main thing that I wanted to kind of simplify. And because I wanted to really kind of play with these teals that are moving throughout this purple and yellow composition, I chose to make it a teal color. Now, there are some other kind of clear colors that are moving through this composition that, for my copy, I have omitted. The one I wanted to kind of point out is the red moving through the composition. You can see in his original, in the lower kind of the voyeur's space, there's a red flowers. Then we kind of move up to the brights of the shoes, follow the pinks through the clothing, and even have this kind of red handbag. And even if you look closer, there's some kind of reds, dark reds hidden in the back of the closet, as well as being caught on the edge of this frame. Now, so you can kind of see there's this pattern of the reds moving through his composition. I have omitted that, so I don't have those reds moving through. Instead, I chose to focus on another color that's moving through the composition. So one of the things I loved about this image is how all of these forms are all of these colors kind of move and echo through this composition.